What I learned at lunchtime was that we can't hear you laughing at us. so we're in the process of setting up cameras so that we can then watch you. Sorry. Is it? Oh, right. Yeah. I just wasn't pointing it. Right. Good. Right. We've done our talking. Could we have some responses? Could you say who you are and
from New York University. I wanted to ask, I guess, a conservation question. This morning we started with a difference of opinion between a curator and a conservator about whether to or how to treat a bronze sculpture that had been outside. Should I start over, or did you hear me well enough? Okay. Well, just to recap very briefly, Glenn Horton, New York University. I'm interested in this question of the conservator's hand and time, the history of sculpture and alteration over time. And we started out this morning with a difference of opinion on whether to adjust the patina on a bronze that had been outdoors. These three sculptures have been indoors, and so it's, in a sense, the effective time has been much less, but they do alter. And as a conservator, I would be tempted to put some sort of a barrier coating to isolate the surface from perhaps acid from people touching the bronze. But that wax that I would probably apply could alter the surface, and I'd be interested in various people's opinions on that. I would be somewhat hesitant to put a wax on an oil-painted bronze, partly because of issues of reversibility, but also altering the reflectance. On a patinated bronze, I would be more tempted to, but I would also be very concerned with a Giacometti type surface, getting microcrystalline wax embedded in crevices. And Valerie, this is partly a question for Valerie, because you started by saying when you became the curator, you had the microcrystalline wax removed, if I got you right.
No, it was put on before I got there, and actually it's still on there, which is why it appears shiny. It has lessened over time because we have lots of people. We have almost 1 million people visit a year, and it's been on view for nearly 25 years in one way or another. But I didn't authorize the removal of the wax on this one because I was worried about what it might do to an already unstable patina. In contrast, we have a 1948 tall figure, one of the three that he did, the most massive one with the tall base. And that had wax on it, but its patina was perfectly stable and rather monochromatic. And so we took the wax off of that, and I gotta tell you, that was a long job getting wax out of all those crevices. So I don't recommend doing it, but whether it stays on or not has to do with do no harm.
Okay, I just wanted to bring up the subject for discussion so we could at least have some conservation intervention in the discussion this afternoon.
Thanks. No.
Hello, Nora Nagy from the Guggenheim Museum. I am a conservator too, and I would like to at least partially answer Glenn's question. If you looked at the Hirschhorn piece, you can actually see that most of the protruding surfaces are shiny. But if you look at on the left side, the deeper crevices, you will see that it's completely matte surfaces with all of, I assume, the original patination on. And especially on the left shoulder area, you will see some areas where I think, Valerie, you pointed out that it is already flaking in tiny, tiny bubbles on the shiny surfaces, which I find personally disturbing and kind of confusing. We had to look at it for a while to actually see that probably, we didn't have her at that time, it was coated by somebody, and then probably accidentally some areas were left out, and compared to the other surfaces, this was shiny and the others were not. So personally, I think this is a destruction of the true history of the piece, and I would be very careful even trying to remove it. I agree with Valerie, because it could lead to serious problems. But aesthetically, for me, as a conservator, seeing it, it disturbs me that it gives me a very contradictory message what it is.
It does, indeed, and it's unfortunate that when the Hirshhorn opened in 1974, the policy was to apply wax to every single bronze, indoors or out. And it's, you know, after 20 years, I'm still undoing some of that or having some of it undone. On the other hand, the Giacometti expert in me wants to say that, well, Alberto loved ambivalence, not necessarily ambiguity, but ambivalence. And I think that our bust, despite the sadness of it having been waxed and the patina not have been stable in the first place, it makes it even more wonderfully ambivalent.
Michael Van Inter with Venues and Archives.
Thanks.
One thing we haven't touched upon, I think, as a reference, we haven't looked at the pure raw ugliness of freshly cast bronze and the reason for patina in the first place. If I could just open that for discussion.
Right. Vernie, you're poised.
It's a very interesting point you're raising, because Giacometti wrote that he liked the metal as nude as possible. He wrote this in just after the war. So there was a point where we know for sure he liked the way the cast went out of the foundry, and what is interesting too is the quality of the bronzes made over a long period of time is not even, and we know for sure that some casts that were made under his supervision are considered not good quality casts. There are some parts that are burnt so deeply that the patina can't be applied to it because it won't stick. The metal becomes too porous. And this was authorized by Giacometti. So he was interested also in the accidents that could come from the casting process. And I think that at some point he would have preferred even to let the metal just out of the casting.
He did, in fact, do that. We own two of them. By sheer chance, we happen to own at the Hirshhorn Giacometti's that Joe Hirshhorn bought, you know, fresh off the presses from the artist, the foundry, the dealer to Hirshhorn, and then to us. And there's one in which it's a 1957 bust of Diego, in which it has that kind of. If you take bronze when it comes out and it's kind of goldeny, but it's messy. It's not an even appealing goldeny. Well, that one was made more appealing and more consistently golden throughout, and then left. And it is slowly, but I'm surprised, very, very slowly changing with time. It's remarkably similar to the earliest photos we have of it. Another one, a much smaller bust of Diego, they didn't put a basic, the undercoating, if you will, of brown or black or dark, on which colors are then affected. He put colors on some places and left the bare bronze as it was, and that one is changing over time as well. So it's interesting to watch those three, the one here, the goldeny one, and the one that's sort of splotchy goldeny, how they're aging with time, because it's a study right there in an experiment by an artist who didn't know really much, if anything, about the chemical aspects of patina, but was interested in their visual effects.
I would link that to the paintings. When he paints, he leaves a part of the canvas without painting on it, and it's true that there is something like that also in the bronzes.
I just have a couple of responses to what you said. First of all, what you say about the product is true, but I also think, you know, if we're going to get into the bronze process, that there is still this miraculous sense when something actually comes out and is something, and it's sort of born from this whole process that the patina in some sense recreates, or and also, I mean, I think about Giacometti. I don't know about truth to materials, but this feeling for fire that he had, and this whole sort of this molten quality of the material itself. So I think there's something in the material itself in bronze. There is a kind of truth to materials, and there is something about the whole process that I think does get built back into the work. And you're right that the patina is necessary to do it, but then I would just want to keep in mind the whole process.
Penelope.
I wanted to ask the other panelists what they thought of Michael Brenson's idea about these being post-surrealist sculptures, which are about inviting interaction from the person who owns them or who might handle them. Because I didn't know whether other people agreed with this idea or not.
Actually, I do. I don't think it's as successful in some of the post-war sculptures as he would have liked, and equally so in many of the paintings. But when they are successful, yes, there's a kind of haunting quality that gets you. There's a connection that he felt with Diego or whatever subject he had in mind, whether it was visual or mental, memory, imagination, and that somehow that transcendent quality, if you will, but not in a religious sense.
Is it to do with touch?
For him, it had to do with touch, but it also had to do with whether when he'd finished touching, I mean, he would model and sometimes paint restlessly, sometimes not even looking at it, just feeling it and feeling it and feeling it. And when it felt right, or when the dealer said he needed it for a show, he stopped. But I think you can tell by your reactions to any of his sculptures whether he stopped at a point where it achieves that. The Walking Men, for example, he did variations on that, and the pose itself you could connect with. But some of them, you look at them, I think it's the one in Pittsburgh from 1960, you experience it, and all of a sudden you've got this connection. It's not a real person, it's not a portrait, the artist has been dead since 1965, and yet there's something that connects, and to me that's the epitome of surreal sculpture.
And there's also, I think, I very much agree, I think there's also this dialogue between matter and perception that's going on, especially in things like this. If you look at a lot of the thin works, when you encounter them, if you turn the corner in a museum or gallery, they strike you with this almost iconic line that then you begin to approach and see the details of the changes, where these, it's so much about being confronted with this sort of obdurate thing, but pocked with these hollows and that create these huge amount of shadows that allow us to look at it and be confronted with the thing as matter, but then pull back on it and see it as the subject as well. I mean, I'm really struck by the shoulders part of the Head and Shoulders. So I think that would agree with that. So
Does someone else want to? I just want to sort of raise this political thing, because Giacometti was certainly not a political artist, but he had politics. And around 34, 35, at the point where he really turned his back on the surrealists, it was a point where he was closely involved with Aragon, was a socialist, and he made political drawings, and he was sympathetic with the Popular Front. And I do think there's a democratizing impulse that's very strong in his work that began increasingly to take over. So within that framework, a lot of this stuff from surrealism obviously got incorporated, but within a completely different language that for which I think the word democratizing is important.
Ruth, were you following on from that, or can I just add a comment? One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, I think, and one of the things that rather intrigues me, is that here you have this sitter, Diego, who is the sitter for the portrait, but then he himself becomes involved in the production of the thing, and so it isn't a self-portrait because it's a portrait by Alberto of his brother, but he's involved with it. It's there's an ambivalence here about it being a self-portrait, but that seems to be perhaps involved in some way in the question that Penelope was asking as well. I don't know, but I don't know of any other example of that in portraiture of the sitter, him or herself.
And that Diego was never tempted to alter them in any way is an indicator of how supportive he was of Alberto, because some of the portraits can be rather scary looking.
Ruth, and then Joe.
Well, Valerie, you brought up this nuts and bolts question, and I really wanted to ask people in the room. I will wondered about this a lot, and that's that word wax. You know, what is the policy now? You've said what you've wanted to do in your collection. I know in that a lot of the bronzes in Tokyo, the Rodins in Tokyo, are all waxed with a color material in them, which has an enormous effect. And I'm just very curious as to what in curatorial groups is the going thought on this now. And what's the history of it?
I'm not sure that many curators think about it at all. It's usually a decision that's made by conservators, at least it has been in my experience. When I became involved in questioning the use of wax at the Hirshhorns, on the Hirshhorn sculptures, there was a reaction of outrage that I would dare to even question the policy. I think that the policy was much more associated with the 1970s. And that in some cases it has done wonders for works. For example, the bronzes that we have outdoors in our sculpture garden, they're right downtown, and like the Musée Rodin in Paris, there's a lot of corrosion that is precipitated very quickly on the bronzes in that environment. By keeping them washed and rigorously waxed, they have not changed in 30 years, but they also don't look good. And so what I've been interested in learning from conservators and the makers of wax, and what we've been doing most recently at the Hirshhorn, is that, for example, establishing that certain artists did not like a shiny surface. Marino Marini, for example. It's a crime to add wax to any of his, but hey, all the ones in the Hirshhorn were waxed. Fortunately, the wax came off, most of them, without any harm. But what's being done with waxes now as a protectant, but without interfering, is much more sophisticated and subtle and much less intrusive aesthetically. The addition of pigments to wax was commonplace in the 70s. Our Burghers of Calais, which had a kind of dark brown to black basic patina with that kind of acid green that the Musée Rodin commissioned on almost all of the post-World War II bronzes, you couldn't see the green. And that was, you know, good to some people because green equaled corrosion. I mean, that's the level of ignorance at that point. And it wasn't, I mean, I didn't even know for the first 4 years that there was brown pigment in the wax that was applied. And as soon as I found out, I stopped, and now it only has clear wax. And now we don't wax it as often, and we're even thinking of leaving it unwaxed for a number of years to allow a certain weathering of the patina. I think it's an institution by institution call.
Perhaps we can ask Hans Peter.
Yes, I think we shouldn't talk about too much with wax, because we never waxed any of our sculptures we have. And I think we are not in the same case than the Rodin people is. We have no sculpture outside. So if you have them inside, and normally they are kind of treated with a little tiny wax after casting and after making the patina. And I think normally it is absolutely enough. And there are in some cases, maybe you had to add a little bit, but in the normal case, I would say, please don't wax it.
I would say please don't either.
Yeah. We have just time for one last question from, I think, Joel Shapiro.
I can pass. It's no longer relevant.
Joel, you're disappointing us.
No, I was interested. I mean, my sense is that the patina in Giacometti is sort of, again, I think the scale is so powerful in the work. You know, Giacometti's hand against the reduced subject creates scale that the patina really can't, it won't challenge that. I mean, one piece may be more seductive than another piece, but the basic core of the work, the essential idea of Giacometti's work, is in the form. And the patina just amplifies it or possibly masks it, but it's there. The patina really doesn't matter that much. By the way, I have one question about waxing at patina. Is it the buffing of the wax that, why are you so afraid to remove the wax from that patina? I know the patina is not stable, but wax is relatively soluble. But what do you think the pigment in the patina or the metallic surface was, the molecular nature was changed when the wax was buffed out?
I don't know. I'm not a conservator, but I started knowing nothing about the treatment or conservation or preservation of sculptures, let alone how patinas are created and aged.
Perhaps we could come back to that, because I think we need to move on now to the next, to Jeff Koons.
Thanks, John.
So, and I imagine some of these questions will come up again. Thank you.